So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, welcome to everyone here tonight. And I'm purposely delaying by a few minutes here because of what we refer to as Michigan time. And the story of academic time really is an ancient tradition and is well established here, wherein if you have a meeting at 3 o'clock, that means that you leave your office at 3 o'clock and you walk and you explain to the person that is in your office, well, I've got a meeting to get to and it starts at 3 o'clock, and so you have to leave your office. And so we have a tradition of Michigan time, which is 10 minutes past the hour, and I think that essentially is where it derives. But I'm going to cut into a little bit of Michigan time here and start a few minutes early. And I want to just share with you that we're so fortunate that this is going to be live broadcast, so we have a live streaming of this event, so people be aware of that. And I understand it's also going to be taped, and so we will have a recording of it, and I'm assuming that we'll be able to stream it from the Procter website. So I want to just open by welcoming you all, near and far, to the 10th Annual Procter Lecture. The 10th Annual Procter Lecture, for me and for many of us and for our speaker here tonight, represents, in many ways, a journey. And Mimi Baird will be talking about her journey. Many of us here tonight have a journey that we've been on. Many of us have come a long way to be here tonight. Many of us have come a long way in our understanding of bipolar disorder and our understanding of how we got to where we are now. On the screen, you'll see our list of sponsors, and we're very grateful for their sponsorship tonight. Without sponsorship, events like this would not happen. Without sponsorship, we wouldn't be able to be here tonight. We wouldn't be having a Procter lecture. We wouldn't really be having the research ongoing that we have were it not for a whole host of sponsors and supporters and at every level. The evening tonight, I want to talk to you a little bit about Mimi Baird. And it's approximately a year ago that I was introduced to her book, and I thank Stephanie Peterson for identifying this. Stephanie joined us a couple of years back, and in her mission to learn more about bipolar disorder, she found a number of books, and one of them was Mimi Baird's book. And so in reading the book, it is just a brilliant piece of literature. It's a brilliant description of the journey of an individual in the middle of the 20th century, essentially, in their experiences in the mental health system, their experiences with treatment, and experiences with the disorder. But equally importantly, the story is about a scientist. It's about a physician. It's about a physician who worked with bipolar disorder. It's about a physician who had bipolar disorder. And it's about a physician who strove to understand his own journey, his own problems with bipolar disorder, and he set about to understand it not just from, what is bipolar disorder, but to really get to the heart of what the science is behind it. So he did a series of experiments that we were talking about today, and these experiments really formed the basis of our understanding of what bipolar disorder is. And so he saw these individuals, he thought that they had something different about them. So he did experiments with animals. He took the adrenal glands out of the animals, and he took some plasma from the individuals in mania, and he was able to demonstrate that the individuals that received the plasma from manic patients, the animals lived longer. With that louder. Thank you very much, Marissa. I'm not close enough to the microphone. I was talking too much science there. So he discovered that if you treated the animals with the plasma from manic patients, even though they were lacking an adrenal gland, they lived significantly longer compared to the animals that did not receive the plasma from the individuals that had mania. So what this meant was that a hypothesis was started really in the 1930s, that there was something fundamentally, something biologically different about individuals with bipolar disorder, and this essentially formed the Catecholamine Hypothesis. And the Catecholamine Hypothesis is really the basis for the medications and the treatments that we have now, all the norepinephrine receptor or the transporter inhibitors, and many of the medications that we have in psychiatry today are really derived from the ideas that Dr. Baird started with in the 1930s. So we're very excited to have Mimi Baird here, and very excited to hear her story and hear her journey about how she discovered her father. Tonight, we're privileged to have Mimi Baird here, and tonight we're going to have some question and answers, and so there'll be 2 Q&A cards that we'll be distributing, and I would like you to put Mimi on one and then panel on the other, and the questions that you have for Mimi, we will address to Mimi after her presentation and her talk, and the ones that are for the panel that's after Mimi's talk, we will then address with the panel. I want to also thank Wally Proctor. Wally turned the tragedy, the most profound tragedy a family can endure, turned her tragedy into a mission, into a vision to help the University of Michigan identify causes, identify treatments, and understand bipolar disorder through research and through the Heinz C. Procter Bipolar Research Fund. I met Wally almost exactly 12 years ago, and we then chatted about how to set up and proceed with the research project, and so we developed ideas that have turned into the Heinz C. Procter Bipolar Research Fund, that turned into the longitudinal study, that has spawned a whole host of research projects. So here tonight, we're honoring the memory of many people. We're honoring their journeys. We're honoring Heinz C. Procter. We're honoring the Procter family who's dedicated so many resources to helping us discover and to learn more about bipolar disorder. And we're here to hear about Mimi Baird's journey as well. So I would like to invite Wally Proctor to the stage now and have her address us and, amongst other things, introduce Mimi Baird. So thank you very much, Wally, for everything that you've done.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to welcome all of you to this, our 10th annual Procter Lecture, and I want to especially welcome our keynote speaker, Mimi Baird. Mimi Baird was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and is a graduate of Colby Sawyer College. Growing up, she learned that her father suffered from manic depression, but it wasn't until 50 years later, when a manuscript written by her father showed up at her front door, that she discovered the struggles he faced suffering from a poorly understood illness in the 1940s and his contribution to the study of bipolar disorder. While working as a manager at the Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center, she met a surgeon who had once known her father, which prompted her quest to finally understand her father's life and legacy and to restore his place in medical history. Her first book, He Wanted the Moon, The Madness and Medical Genius of Dr. Byrd, was published in 2015. And I had the good fortune to meet her yesterday, and we talked for several hours about some of our common experiences that we had with bipolar. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and privilege to introduce to you Mimi Baird. Thank you.
First of all, I thank you, Dr. McGinnis. Thank you, Wally. Thank you, Stephanie. This is a huge, huge privilege to be here. Never in my wildest imaginations, as I was sitting in my tiny little office in Woodstock, Vermont, that I would be in this august environment. And Dr. McGinnis, you brought my father alive. That's one of my objectives. He's alive today. He's valued. You've tied him from what he did back in those early years of the late 30s and early 40s, tied it into the Procter Bipolar Research Fund. So we're kind of like bookends. It's a wonderful feeling, wonderful feeling. I want to start out by being very honest with you all. When I am speaking, I'm reliving my past. Oh, before I start, I wanted to thank the people that are coming and listening to this through the live feed. There are a number of my friends, and my daughter is on the live feed. Hello, Woo. That's my nickname for Meg. So this is wonderful to have the support of my friends that way. Anyway, to go back, when I'm speaking, you obviously will understand I'm reliving my past. I wrote the book Behind a Stone Wall, which was emotionally necessary, and it really was the only way to face the obvious challenges. But now that I'm out in the public and actually saying my father's words, certain passages may cause me to choke up. Someday it's one particular passage, while another day it's an entirely different one. So I can say right now this is an emotional day for me, so if I do that, we just have to take a deep breath and go on. And I also wanted to say that after my talk, we're going to show some family photos, about 10 of them, and I've never done that before. So this is the maiden voyage of family photos. Now today I would like to dedicate my reading to my father. My father, Dr. Perry C. Baird, who endured multiple indignities and hardships during his many incarcerations in mental institutions, who desired to see a future where treatments would be more humane for patients, and who also envisioned a kinder, more tolerant perception on the part of mankind towards the mentally ill. My father was born in 1903 in Mexia, Texas, shortly before the family moved to Dallas. He breezed through his early academic studies, finishing the University of Texas in 3 years. His acceptance at Harvard Medical School in 1924 was his reward. He graduated in 1928 with the highest academic honors possible at that time. He served his internship at the University of Michigan and his residency at Harvard. Shortly after his marriage to my mother on Christmas Day, 1931, he succumbed to a full-blown public manic attack on December 2nd, 1932, while attending a medical meeting in New York. As a result, his appointment to a professorship at Harvard Medical School was withdrawn, a stark example of the stigma of those days. It is generally acknowledged today, as you all know, that mental illness is a serious and prevalent disease. My father would have agreed. In my father's day, his ailment was known as manic depressive psychosis. Today, it's called bipolar disorder. In the 1930s, no effective medication for manic depression existed, as there was little understanding of how the illness worked and little compassion for its effects. My father writes, "The quickness and impulsiveness of actions and speech have a very disquieting effect upon others, and it is hard to maintain good judgment and full awareness of this effect of one's actions on others." As the Heinz Procter Bipolar Research Fund states, It is a brain illness with profound swings of mood, ranging from mania, uncontrolled energy, to debilitating depression. It is estimated that it affects almost 6 million people, no matter age, race, ethnic groups, or social class. Bipolar disorder is a physical illness that can be devastating to careers, personal and social relationships, affecting the whole person, a family, a community, and can run in families. In my family, the bipolar gene is rampant. The following members of my family have suffered or are now suffering from some form or variation of the illness. My grandfather Baird, my father, his 2 brothers, a Baird cousin, my niece, and my grandfather and grandmother on my mother's side. We are watching the grandchildren on both sides of the family for signs of illness. For myself, I've been spared the harsh side of this ailment, but I do have a tendency to buy items in multiples. Like instead of buying 1 pair of shoes, I will buy 4. I had 3 objectives in writing He Wanted the Moon. The first objective was to fulfill my father's wishes to publish his manuscript, an 11-inch tall collection of onion skin paper. Onion skin paper was the paper that was used for seconds, when people typed letters. They didn't send emails. And my father's secretary would bring out to the mental institutions number 2 pencils and onion skin paper. The number of pages was 1,172 pages. As a doctor, he wanted to educate the public about what it was like to be mentally ill, to be treated for this illness, and in the process increase the awareness and understanding of this type of disability and try to reduce the prevailing wind of disgrace. I discovered my father's writings in the spring of 1994. My job took me to Dallas, Texas for an annual medical meeting. Upon arrival, I contacted my father's younger brother, Philip, who I knew was still alive. We met at my hotel for breakfast. After hashing out our differences, I guess Uncle Philip decided I was a good egg, and so he told me about my father's manuscript. Nobody in his family was interested in my father's work. It was almost as if the papers were perceived as being contagious, which that's an interesting choice of words. Finally, at the age of 13, his youngest son, Randy Baird, agreed to keep the manuscript. I spoke with Randy each evening while I was in Dallas, and on May 14, 1994, a box full containing my father's papers, as Dr. McGinnis said, arrived at my doorstep. I immediately called Randy. His wife, Karen, said the following thing: "We are so very happy. At last, they're where they belong. Barry's little girl has his papers. We've only been the caretakers." The pages of the manuscript were completely out of sequence. I did my best to make sense of his words. On one page, he was writing about having breakfast at the Ritz. On the next, he was being violently restrained by hospital nurses. If these pages held a key to the mystery of my father, they weren't going to give them up easily. After Xeroxing the work, I placed them in a big safe deposit box at the TD Bank in Woodstock, and they remained there from 1994 to 2015. On September 2nd, 2015, along with my son and grandson, I took the manuscript to the Francis A. Countway Library at Harvard Medical School. It was there that I found the letters between my father and his mentors, the eminent physiologist, Dr. Walter Cannon, the endocrinologist, Fuller Albright, and J. Howard Means, who was like a father to my father. A recent example of the power of my father's words on these papers is the following. A friend received a letter from a friend who she had known for years. He read he wanted the moon and underlined the following passages and sent it to her. My father's words. So many errors in judgment and behavior collect together to form a formidable array of enemies striving to destroy the whole self, including that which is good, useful, honorable, and loyal. How can we separate the bad self from the good without destroying both? Despair, that mood which paralyzes thought and action and makes eternal sleep a goal and a prayer. The friend of my friend then told her that for years he had been secretly suffering from a mental illness, and because of he wanted the moon, he was now publicly coming to terms with his condition and seeking treatment. Meeting people at book readings and hearing their stories reflect the influence of my father's words. This is also the case during Q&A sessions. As an example, I received a letter when, after reading He Wanted the Moon, the writer feels free to express his own illness. He writes me, "My brain and mind are a huge spider web. I'm exhausted from the depression. The mania is relentless. How aggravating it is to be going along okay, and then like a meteor from the heavens comes that bout of mania out of nowhere. It strips you of your steadiness and turns your life upside down, and when it finally decides to leave, it gives you a gift of depression." Later, this same individual wrote me actually a couple of weeks before I came here, and he said the following: "I am simply managing my life, doing what needs to be done to keep it moving, trying to be the best me I can." And I'm going to say that again because I think this is brilliant. Trying to be the best me I can. The second reason for publishing the book was to return my father to his place in medical history. He has earned this recognition by conducting unique, at that time, experiments and research on the theory that there is a biochemical component to the manic depressive psychosis. His initial findings were published in June of 1944 in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease and an educational journal of neuropsychiatry. At this time, my father was still a patient in Westboro State Mental Hospital in Massachusetts, and the doctors would not let him read his own article. It was very hard to be a physician and be in a mental institution. It was, the role reversal. The importance of his early experiments cannot be minimized. In his era, the belief was that mental instability was a psychological one. Once the theory was established that biochemical imbalance was indeed found in mental illnesses, medication became possible, which, of course, as we know, that is today. But for my father, this was not the case. Therefore, his writings are pure manic in expression, a unique contribution to medicine. But during these years, my father was descending from normalcy to a revolving state of manic depressive psychosis, from which there was, in his lifetime, no return. The following are a few excerpts from my father's preliminary scientific findings from the discussion section of the paper. These experiments have provided biological evidence that the blood of manic patients may differ from the blood of healthy subjects. These experiments were carried out to ascertain whether or not it would be possible to demonstrate in the blood of manic patients, an increase in circulating cortical hormone. It is not assumed that these experiments have proved this to be the case. It is assumed only that evidence has been found to indicate that adrenal ectomized animals, when injected with manic blood, behave differently from similar animals injected with healthy blood. The most striking observation of this series of experiments are in reference to the strength of 2 of the rats and 2 of the cats injected with manic blood. A search for further evidence regarding the nature of the effect would surely seem justifiable. Perhaps this, and this is towards the end of the article, perhaps this report will stimulate added interest in the manic psychosis as a physiological and general medical problem rather than purely a psychological problem. It may be hoped that other investigations will continue these studies. This paper is preliminary in nature, but it is published at this time because of the necessity of postponing further experiment for an indefinite and uncertain period of time. He never went back to Dr. Cannon's lab because of multiple incarcerations. One of the first fruits of this second objective is the following. I was participating in a roundtable discussion about He Wanted the Moon at our library in Woodstock, Vermont. After the discussion ended, a gentleman approached me and said he wanted to get my father's research paper republished. Can you imagine how I felt to hear that? It turned out that he was Matthew Friedman, the nationally revered psychiatrist who is an expert in the understanding and treatment of post-traumatic stress syndrome. And he was doing his work, he does his work in the Veterans Hospital, and we have a very good Veterans Hospital in White River Junction, Vermont. After reading my father's scientific paper, Dr. Friedman wrote me the following. Your father was a true pioneer who recognized the importance of HPA, which is hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical system dysregulation in affective disorders. Had he been permitted to pursue his initial studies, his work would have accelerated our understanding of the pathophysiology of affective disorders. Another opportunity to meet or to reach the medical community was at the annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association in May of 2016. I was part of a 3-person panel titled 120 Years of Inpatient Psychiatry, a discussion of the evolution of psychiatric hospitalization into the 21st century. At this session, I read several passages from He Wanted the Moon describing the environment and treatment that my father endured during those years. To understand what my father endured makes his scientific expressions that much more remarkable. He worked in Dr. Cannon's laboratory between incarcerations. He was a driven man. Here are a few examples from He Wanted the Moon that I presented. Medical, I think you all, the ones who have read the book, know that I was able to secure my father's medical records before the Hipaa Act. The patient became, the medical record note says the following. The patient became destructive, took his bed, which he managed to bend, and proceed to knock the plaster off the windowsill. It was necessary to place him in restraint. He resisted with vigor, and with his great strength, this was difficult. My father wrote, a straitjacket was brought forward, and I was instructed to put my arms into the sleeves that were built in a solid rectangular pattern. I was then told to lie on a bed standing at the end of the otherwise empty room next to a window. I followed orders without making any comment, but with a mounting sense of indignation and deep despair. The straitjacket was made of canvas, and strong canvas ribbons dangled from its edges in pairs. These were tied securely to each side, and at the foot of the bed, the 16 or 18 such pairs of ribbons formed powerful anchors to the bed, allowing slight motion. I was left alone. Another medical record note: the patient again became destructive. He broke the panels from the door of his room, broke the sashes from the window, dismantled the window casing, and with a window weight in each hand, and was very threatening towards the employees, but he did not strike them. My father wrote, "Soon after reaching my room, a type of treatment known as constant restraint was put into effect. I do not recall having done anything violent or uncooperative. I was subject to the most exhausting, the most painful, and most barbaric treatment which I can conceive of in this modern age. The constant restraint procedure consisted of maintaining alternation between straitjackets and cold packs." My father writes, "Then began the agonizing experience of being wrapped tightly in cold sheets soaked in ice water that were folded according to various patterns and laid across the bed over a rubber mattress. The initial impact of these ice-cold sheets on the spine is pure pain. Every additional contact with cold sheets as they are wrapped around the body brings chills and continued discomfort." There is a passage in the manuscript where my father writes to his lawyer complaining about these treatments. He talks about the famous psychiatrist Adolph Meyer of Baltimore. Dr. Meyer requires men who study under him to take all the treatments which they intend to use later. There is surely no other way to know just what a treatment may mean to a patient. The manic suffers more than a doctor would. The third objective of He Wanted the Moon was to highlight the practice of keeping family secrets, keeping silence. In many families today, I suspect this tradition has been going on for generations. My grandmother kept secrets, my mother kept secrets, and I did a pretty good job of keeping secrets as well. As hard as it is to talk about matters that are difficult, it is essential that we are honest with family members about our inheritance. Silence shapes lives. Some say generational experience are housed in our cells. Genes cannot be ignored. Being aware of the possibility that a mental health situation could manifest in a loved one can enable us to be prepared as possible. Stoicism and numbness can only work just so long. Being forthcoming with friends and neighbors can also help in supporting the afflicted person in their family. It is never too late to look into our family's past. One of the joys of putting together He Wanted the Moon was the serendipitous nature of the experience. In a chance conversation with Dr. Radford Tanzer at the Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center, I found out he knew my father. This fact inspired me to start my journey to find my father. Because I worked in a hospital, I knew how to order my father's medical records. 1 year later, President Clinton signed into law in August of 1996 the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, professionally known as Hipaa. The act restricts the release of records of patients who have an alcohol, drug, or mental problem. Of course, the mental records that I got played a huge role in the book. My telephone conversation with Amity Slays regarding a Calvin Coolidge matter I was on the board of the Calvin Coolidge Memorial Foundation for ages, and quite enamored with our 30th American president. It's from Vermont. Led to finding an incredible agent in New York who bravely took on my manuscript. It is this agent who was negotiating before the hardcover came out in February of 2015, for He Wanted the Moon to become a film. And for those of you who haven't heard this extraordinary thing, Brad Pitt's production company, Plan B, has optioned He Wanted the Moon. Plan B won an Oscar this past year for Best Adapted Screenplay for The Big Short. 12 Years a Slave and Selma are just a few of the Pitt films that highlight major threads of our human history and existence. They have never done a film on mental illness and are honored and extremely excited to be doing so. The legendary screenwriter Tony Kushner, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Angels in America, and most recently twice Oscar nominated for the best screenplay in Munich and Lincoln, is on board for He Wanted the Moon. An early review of the film to be was written by Lisa Rossman on April 8, 2016, for Signature Reads, a Hollywood online magazine. Tony Kushner has signed on to write the screenplay for He Wanted the Moon, which means it is bound to contain all the timely elements that makes this story so brilliantly mythological. The ethics, the science, the history, the mid-century cultural mores surrounding mental illness, and the limitations of heteronormative family structures, especially in the intelligentsia of the U.S. Northeast, which is where I'm from and which my father had to get used to coming from Dallas, Texas. That was a very tough assimilation for him to a different type of social environment. When Tony Kushner and I went to visit Westboro in January 21st of 2016, the following passage written by my father echoed as we walked through the grim, deteriorating buildings. My father's quote, "I pray to God that in the future I shall be able to remember that once one has crossed the line from the normal walks of life into a psychopathic hospital, one is separated from friends and relatives by walls thicker than stone, walls of prejudice and superstition. It may be hoped that psychopathic hospitals will someday become a refuge for the mentally ill and a place where they can hope to recover through channels of wise and gentle care. But the modern psychopathic hospitals I have known are direct descendants of ancient jails like Bedlam, and I believe they do harm, not good. The brutalities that one encounters in state and city psychopathic hospitals must be the byproduct of fear and superstition with which mentally ill patients are regarded. For the present, the best one can hope to do is to stay out of these places, pity those confined there, and do what one can to accelerate the slow process of mental hospital reorganization." And I know from going to that meeting with the American Psychiatric Association, that's exactly what's happening, and of course, you all are involved in that today. I would like to end this presentation with my father's words, which include many hallucinations. I've taken these quotes that were just scattered throughout the manuscript and put them in chronological order. So we're going to start with a quote. He's referring to the week before he was taken away in February of 1944. So the first quote is, "The characters involved came to life as a daily occurrence on the stage of memory." I had a tough time with this one. "And I seemed to form hands with them and frolic a little once again, as we did for such a brief few hours before darkness closed in. So much happened so quickly, so much to remember forever, so much to haunt the corridors of my memory. The horrible debacle of being picked up by the police at the country club, a painful memory, so much to mock me and harass me. To the end of life, to the end of life, to the end of life. My thoughts wandered with all anchorage eliminated. It seemed that I must have traveled back through the subconscious impressions imposed upon the origin of man, the nature of his soul, and the nature of eternal life. I visualized the migration of a tiger-like creature that flew on silver wings from a distant planet to Earth thousands of years ago. I dreamed about the soul and discovered it was a magnetic field. My thoughts dwelled upon world affairs, the war and peace, and how to deal with Russia, Japan, and Germany. I pictured a peace conference. Perception of color became intense. The lips of most of the patients looked intensely red, unnaturally so, as if they had a coating of very dark lipstick. I was ripe for an explosion. My depression deepened into melancholia, which distracted me from the ability to act and think. My imagination took on the speed of light. I thought that the entire Westboro region had in some way been detached from Earth and was catapulting through space like a rocket ship. For a while, I thought we were at the bottom of the ocean between Greenland and the British Isles. For many days during this time, the light bulb held my interest. I never knew what type of a bulb it was, but it seemed to contain a gas, perhaps a mercury vapor, which took on a kidney shape and slowly changed into shapes round and oval, and sometimes it looked like false teeth opening and closing, as in laughter or conversation. In this atmosphere of boredom, loneliness, uselessness, I think of my own little world having come to an end. I am divorced from my wife, and I'm coming to the realization of what it means to have a family broken up. I haven't seen my children since I came to Westboro. My profession has been taken away from me. The clouds are black, and I see no silver lining. My license has been revoked. Routine notices began to appear. Instructions to notify medical societies and hospitals. My name withdrawn from the telephone book, from the directory listing on my building, from the door of my office. My heart is slowly breaking. Somehow, I cling to a feeling of confidence in the belief that my own personal destiny has some strange meaning beyond that which I can see in the past or predict for the future. And what's happened is we have the book, we have the film, and then some of you may know or have heard of Dr. Elliot Wallenstein. He used to be a professor of psychology at the University of Michigan. And I, at the encouragement of my therapist wrote a synopsis of my father's work that appeared in a psychiatric journal. And Dr. Elliot Valenstein, who is still alive, 93 years old, I talked to him today for a half hour, he charged across the street, went into the library, and looked up the date of the paper that was the accepted one that was published by Dr. John Cade of Australia, and that was published in 1949, and my father's paper was published in 1944. So that's 5 years difference, and that's something that's going to be part. I want him to get that recognition. So that last quote that I read you, somehow I cling to the feeling of confidence in the belief that my own personal destiny has some strange meaning beyond that which I can see in the past or predict in the future, was really something. Do you want to do the slides? Thank you for listening, and it means everything to me that each one of you is here. Very special to me. And I'm sure my father's in this room. So what have we got here? Okay. I guess I better step down here and see which one they are. Oh, whoops, I've got to listen. I've got to do this.
The microphone here.
Yeah, that'd be good.
That would be testing.
Okay, can you do that? Okay. All right, so this, can you hear me? Yeah. So this is the graduation photo of my father. And as I said before, he's from Dallas, Texas, and he was a very proud Texan. And he really made his way in all of our stuffy New England ways. And he was Phi Beta Kappa. And you can see on that little, well, I guess it's not a string, but it's a cord, a golden chain, and he has his Phi Beta Kappa hanging there. You see how proud he was. And this is my father, who looks just like my nephew. And he's got his white coat on, which we know is a big deal. And in the background is Harvard Medical School. Okay? And that's my mother, Greta Gibbons, Baird, and they were married on Christmas Day in 1931. This is the house that we lived in as a family, and from my date of birth, which was in 1938. And this is the little house that an awful lot happened in. And when I would ask my mother about, this was in later years, about things that I suspected went on, she said, "Oh, well, Mimi, you that's just your imagination. You couldn't possibly have heard because of the walls." Well, the walls back in those days had no insulation. So I heard and saw everything. Okay. This is the facade of the front of my father's office at 270 Commonwealth Avenue. And it was fairly near the Ritz-Carlton Hotel that faced the Boston Garden. And he would walk over there and have a very fancy lunch between patients. Okay. Now, my father did things in multiples as way, and he had 3 horses, not 1, but 3 horses. And he learned to ride when he was a young boy in Texas. And he's riding here in one of the hunts in the Dover, Dedham, Medfield area of Boston. And they dressed, in their hunting reds and top hats, and it was all very grand. And one of the big myths was that he had ridden into 2 horse shows, which could be absolutely impossible, but that's all part of the memory of those days. Okay? And this is another one of his horses, and this is at Powers Stable in Dover, Massachusetts, where my father boarded his horses. And that's me at a very young age, I think 1939, so I'm just over a year old. I don't think I look particularly thrilled about the experience, but my father just wanted me to do everything with him, which is why I missed him so much. Okay, and this photograph is of myself on the left, my sister Catherine in the middle, and my mother on the right. And the significance of that, it was taken the Boston Gardens in 1944, just after my father was incarcerated. So my happy soul is what got me through life. My sister is obviously distressed, and my mother is holding us together. And this is my father in later years. It's Bradford Bachrach was a very eminent photographer, and he took this very formal picture of my father in the 1940s. And as I said here, the Bachrach group took photographs of every American president since Abraham Lincoln. And it's interesting to look at my father's eyes. I wanted to have this in the book, but the powers that be at Crown Publishing, which published my books, felt that my father's look was a little too scary, I guess, so we didn't use it. And this is a colored postcard of Westboro State Hospital, where my father was incarcerated 3 times. And doesn't it look pretty? And lush, and it just looks like that would be a fun place to go, but it wasn't a fun place to be. So anyway, that gives you a few visuals. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for sharing. So if you go up to the back onto the podium here, thank you so much for sharing your journey in discovering your father, and thank you for sharing the information about your father, and thank you for sharing the photographs, and just a very elegant man in every way, and so I know how proud you are of him, and rightly so.
Thank you.
There's one thing that I wanted to emphasize in your reading of his comments, and that was what a true scientist Perry Baird was, because he had the insight to recognize the challenges in his own work. And in his comments at the end of his paper, he pointed out that this work needed to be scrutinized, it needed to be tested, it needed to be validated. And so he's a very honest and man of integrity, and that is something that we all admire with him. So thank you for sharing his story. So I'm going to take a seat here, and if anyone has more 3x5 cards, so we can start with them. So I'm just going to read them from here. And so the first one says that you said that families keep secrets. When your father became ill, what did your mother say to you was wrong with your father, and how did this affect you?
Well, basically, she said nothing. And I grew up with most of my friends' fathers were doctors. A lot of them were in the war. Even if it wasn't wartime, they worked long hours at the hospital. And so my mother would just say, "He's away." And as a child, you learn that you're not supposed to ask questions. So just the next day happened, and we just would go about our business. And that was, the Victorian way of coping with hardship and heartache, was just not to talk about it. And as a child, you're going to go out and ride your bike, and you just carry on.
And your fondest memory of your father, what would you, do you have the many wonderful photos here, is there one particular memory that you feel is the fondest memory of your father?
Well, the thing is that, like post-traumatic stress syndrome, the stuff that Dr. Friedman does, is when you have been exposed to trauma, you have disassociation and you become numb and all of that. And I'm afraid to say that a lot of those early memories have been blocked out. But what stays with me, and I'm slowly starting to learn more about my past now that the book is published, was my father's. He doted on me and even took me to medical meetings. I mean, you imagine.
Did he have a nickname for you?
Not that I know of, but he took me everywhere, and he paid a tremendous amount of attention to me when he was home. And I think you see that void of that attention and affection suddenly wasn't there anymore between 6 and 8.
There are a couple of questions that relate to the use of the word incarcerated and as opposed to being hospitalized. Can you comment on the selection or the choice of that term to describe the experiences that he was?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, that's a good question because those are the words he wrote in his manuscript. He used incarceration. And also in the medical records, the word incarceration was there a tremendous amount. Occasionally they used the word admitted, but incarceration was pretty prevalent. Mm-hmm. And I guess that was just an easier way of describing something that was pretty awful.
So you showed us a picture of his the place where he practiced, and in the book it points out that he's lunching at the Ritz. And so there's a question about the selection of hospitals for him, because I think the Westboro was a state hospital. Were there no options for him to seek private care? Or
Absolutely. No, that's a great question also. He, in the beginnings, he went to Boston Psychopathic and some of the local ones near the MGH, but when he had to stay longer, my aunt, who was quite wealthy, paid for him to be admitted to McLean, and he was there several times, and that's why it's fascinating that my father went out to McLean to draw blood from manic patients for his experiments when he in turn had been a patient there. So and then he went to Ballpate, which is and that's a private place, and my aunt paid for that. Okay. But his incarcerations became, multiple. I see. And the times between incarcerations got smaller and smaller, and my aunt just couldn't afford. So he had to go into these state institutions like Westboro, Danvers, Bridgewater.
Yes, and I'm just in appreciation of the time. There are, of course, many, many questions here regarding the film and the excitement around that. And so how do you hope, mania is such a magnetic topic for a film, one person points out, how do you hope that Brad Pitt's company will address this topic for him? And who do you hope will play your father?
I can't, under, mum's the word.
Of course.
Until
your secrets are safe here.
Yeah, right. Yeah, little birdie told me. There's a strong suspicion that he may, but we don't know, and right. they're not going to until Tony Kushner finishes the screenplay, which he emailed me the other day to say he hoped the first draft would be finished by the end of the year. So once you get the screenplay, and then the different people that I have heard from Tony Kushner, who I think are going to be candidates for my father's role and myself, will come forth. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to talk about that next winter. But I do want to say that I had long conversations with the people that run Plan B, and I would not sign the 86-page contract until I knew that they were going to be honest with the interpretation of my father's book, treat it with respect, treat it with dignity, and that it was to be as authentic as possible. And they are going to do that. It's going to be like A Beautiful Mind, if any of you saw that, and it's not going to be like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
And certainly in our discussions this afternoon, I was really impressed with your insistence of dignity to be held with that. That's rather. There are a number of questions that relate to the awareness of mental illness in society and the dignity by which individuals in hospitals are treated presently, even now. Do you feel that there still is a need to change our views on mental illness? And do you feel that the treatment that individuals that are treated for bipolar disorder and other psychiatric disorders, are they treated well in hospital now? Or
I don't know, because I've had no experience. I've learned so much from just being with you all for the last 2 days.
It's been our pleasure.
I've had no reason. I haven't had any close friends that I've gone to the hospital and become part of their care, so I can't address that. And I try to stay away from being an expert at or trying to understand all the medical and medication ramifications, because I just don't have the background. I just want to stick with the story, so I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
One of the striking things that it comes out in the book is how the illness affected the family, and it led to the divorce of your parents. Do you know how, or the details of it, how it truly affected the relationship between your mother and your father, and how that really affected the family dynamics?
Well, you see, again, it was the code of silence. And literally, my mother married 2 years after they were divorced, and we moved out of that cute little house, and it was just sort of an unwritten rule that I didn't talk about my father, that I had to pay attention to my stepfather, who I did not like because I kept thinking my father was going to come home again. And so my mother, I will say this, she was in love with my stepfather. They had a good life together. It was, she had a terrible life missing her father, and then to have her husband become ill as well. So, I don't know, the absence of my father was the elephant in the room.
Yeah. What would you like to see done to help reduce the suicide rate among those with bipolar disorder or other mental illnesses? Is one question that drives from the audience.
Yeah, and here again, I haven't had any direct experience with friends or relatives or that have committed suicide, but I guess the only thing that I could say about that is, if we keep things under wraps and we don't talk about what's going on in a family, and we aren't proactive about acknowledging a person's frailties, that, I don't think anything's going to help suicide, but at least if we could be more honest and open with family members and neighbors about these afflictions, it might help. But I don't have personal experience.
Yes, well, thank you. And there's one very nice, warm comment here. It's an important need for a child to be able to idolize their parent while growing up. What was your experience with this in light of what happened? And the comment is that it is so dear and wonderful to see you being able now to idolize your father in your adulthood. And the question is that in that transition, how did, and you've shared your journey so elegantly with us, but can you identify one or significant milestones in your personal development that changed your view of your father or crystallized your view of your father?
It's happening right now.
It's happening right now.
I mean, there are some things that I have said today as asides or answering questions or making comments that I've never said before.
Right.
So because I had to write the book from a distance, and now going out to different groups, this, of course, is the most amazing opportunity here. Each talk builds on another, and I get more confidence. I guess it's more confidence in listening to my feelings that have been wrapped, they've been in a lockbox.
Yeah.
So some of the things I said today I've never said before.
Wonderful. We're so privileged and honored for you to share that with us. And I think that to me, both as a human being and as a psychiatrist and as a physician, I like to emphasize that development and the human progress is an ongoing thing. And we've had discussions in the lab and just in every way that human development is something that is evolving. Normally, we think about development as something that occurs in our childhood. We develop and what was your early development like? But development continues in a very powerful way.
Yes,
and
very powerful.
You're just a phenomenal example of that. There's a question that asks, what brought on his incarcerations more, the mania or the depression?
I think he had maybe more mania than depression, but I think his depressions were really debilitating. And of course his mania got him into a lot of trouble. But I would say on the high side of mania and a lower side of depression.
Yeah. There's a comment and a question here about the increasing awareness of mental illness in a family, and you've shared with us that it's affected your family in a number of different ways. Do you think that a family, having grown up with the information that you have, and now the family having more information themselves, are they able to better deal with this comparatively now as compared to your experience growing up?
Oh my gosh, it's just all the difference in the world. Because once I started working on this and discovering things, I shared them with my nieces and nephews. I shared them with my own children. My sister was not interested at all in this project and didn't want, family dynamics in homes where you have mental illness can be very complex. And so her approach was that she didn't want to know. It was better just not to know. So it was sort of a continuation of that Victorian way. So she hadn't even told her children about the book. And she unfortunately passed a pancreatic cancer just before the book came out.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But what happened, because I don't think it would have been hard for her to reconcile with this at our age, so I think it was a blessing. But then it allowed me the opportunity of telling her children, and each one of her children, their problems. Her side happened to get that gene more than my buying shoes, and so we've been able to educate her children and her grandchildren.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Because we have a niece, and then my niece is bipolar. Her two children were being watched carefully. My other niece, son has been diagnosed bipolar, and my nephew has a son that has some interesting behavioral patterns.
Right. Well, I can certainly say that they're so fortunate and blessed in every way to have someone such as you in the family that has been able to take on such a formidable challenge and bring the story forward and share it with us. And I admire you intensely for the courage, for the energy, and the determination. And we were discussing today, I was just thinking back, what I was doing in 1994, and thinking and imagining what it would have been like, for you at the time to receive this, huge box of papers and trying to think through how to approach the problem. And I just want to applaud you for your work and for everything that you've accomplished with us with this. It is a tremendous contribution to humanity, and we're very grateful for what you've done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, mercy.
And we look forward to the movie coming. Thank you very much. I would like to now call upon our panel members to take a seat here in the panel. And the panel members are researchers with our bipolar research group that's began with the Heinz C. Procter Bipolar Research Fund, and we have in our audience many members of our supporters, and I just want to make a call out to Judy Tam, who's in the row here, Pat Wagner and her family, and so many others that have supported our work. We're so very grateful. Without you, we would not be able to do what we're doing. I was so proud of the accomplishments that we had. We've had now, I think I did a count the other day, 1,251 individuals that are in our longitudinal study, and to appreciate what that means is that these are individuals that are producing data, that are contributing elements of their personal experience with the illness, and we get information from them on a regular basis, and it is our mission, our goal, to be able to understand and learn why people develop the illness, why people develop episodes, why issues and problems emerge, why other people seem to do well, what makes them well, what makes them better, and how we can improve the quality of the lives of individuals with bipolar disorder. So that is our mission. We are dedicated to doing that, and we simply love what we do. So I'm going to hand it over now to the panel for introductions, and we've had Mimi has introduced herself. I just realized I didn't really say my name. My name is Melvin McInnes, and I'm the Thomas B. and Nancy Upjohn Woodworth Professor of Bipolar Disorder and the Scientific Director of the Heinz C. Procter Bipolar Research Fund here at the University of Michigan. So I'm going to sort of just suggest we start at the far end of the panel there. And Stephanie, please.
Stephanie. Why not? So my name is Stephanie Proctor, and I want to thank you again. I picked up this book a little bit ago, and seeing you here today, I feel as if both of our dads are here, and your dad, in a way, speaking about what are the plans for destiny, and my dad speaking about always making a difference in this world. It feels right that we're sitting together today. So I thank you so much for your work and for his insight and for his voice. And I also, reading it, was thinking it would be such an honor to find my dad's writing and know what was going on, during those times. So beyond words. So I worked with the research team a couple years back, and then I transitioned into outreach and working with suicide prevention. I'm currently a photography student at Washtenaw Community College, and I am working with the Cancer Center, doing an internship over there, and I'm also a board chair for Fresh Start Clubhouse here in Ann Arbor. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Simon Evans. I'm on the research faculty here, and I've been working in Melvin's group for maybe 7 years or so. My background is in neurochemistry and molecular and cellular biology, but really in the last 5, 6, 7 years have transitioned to really focus on below-the-neck biology in a psychiatric population, kind of from the premise that the brain does not live in a vacuum, and the health of the body and a lot of the metabolic systems have an effect on both brain health, brain function, and behavior. And so I've been interested in studying psychiatric illness from that perspective.
Hi, I'm Emily Maurer Provost, and I'm an assistant professor here in computer science. And it's been my honor and privilege to work with the Depression Center now, specifically Melvin McGinnis and his team, for about 4 years. About 4 years ago, Melvin approached me with a really interesting question, which is, how can we change the way we monitor patients with bipolar disorder? How can we look for new ways of thinking about deploying technology that would allow us to more accurately track the progression and the effectiveness of treatment? And so what we wanted to do was try to figure out how we can use speech technology to try to get inside the mind of individuals with bipolar disorder, how we can use speech technology to track wellness over time, how we can use speech technology to find ways of understanding someone's well-being without requiring them to do anything, how we could do this naturally. And so for the past 4 years, we've been looking at how we can use conversational speech data collected from cell phones that we've been lucky enough to have deployed in the field to ask this question. And what our research has shown is that speech can be used to effectively identify signs of both mania and depression in our cohort. And we're so excited to continue this research, looking at how we can expand our patient population further and how we can look at similar types of technological deployment for individuals at risk for suicide.
Okay, I want to begin by thanking you for inviting us to speak. And I have to say it's pretty daunting being up here and telling you a little bit about our cell work when I'm sitting next to Mimi, who's done such an amazing presentation tonight. I'm Sue O'Shea, and I'm a professor in the Department of Cell and Developmental Biology here at the medical school. And our laboratory uses induced pluripotent stem cells to model and hopefully understand bipolar disorder. And the work is really based on some research that was done about 5 years ago that won the Nobel Prize in Medicine at that time. So basically what we can do now is take skin samples, and skin cells are a pretty highly differentiated cell type. And using the technologies that the Nobel laureates developed, we can literally set back the biological clock in these cells and tell a very differentiated blood cell or a skin cell to, instead of behaving as though they're differentiated, to take on the characteristic of a cell that might have come from an early embryo. So we can now take stem cells from individuals with bipolar disorder and undiagnosed controls, differentiate them into neurons and glial cells of the brain, and compare them. And for the very first time, we can test medicines that might be useful in bipolar. We can characterize the difference between the neurons from bipolar individuals and controls. And that's what our lab is really focused on understanding. So we know a little bit about the differences so far. Bipolar neurons are very different in how they differentiate. They tend to want to form inhibitory interneurons, while control cells, the neurons that we derive from the controls, tend to form excitatory glutamatergic cells. We know that the bipolar cells are more active in a tissue culture dish interacting with each other, and that when we put a drug into the culture medium like lithium chloride, which is used to treat bipolar disorder, that we can revert this and calm those cells down. So what we believe is for the very first time we've got a viable cell culture model to study and identify new drugs that we might use to treat bipolar in an individual kind of way. So I want to finish by saying thank you to all of you, whether you've given to the Procter Fund to help us do this kind of work, whether or not you've given us a skin sample so that we can study bipolar disorder. We're really grateful for your contributions. Thanks.
Well, I think you've heard enough from me, but each one of these individuals sitting at this table, I've had the honor of spending some time with. This is a very august and impressive group, and it's a huge privilege and honor to be sitting amongst you. And congratulations for what you're doing. Keep doing it, and we're there to support you in any way we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mimi. Thank you. One of the great privileges is that we collaborate across the institution, and I think we tallied up that we have 9 different schools that we we have collaborative programs and projects with, and we literally have billions of data points for each of the individuals, and so it is truly a big, the concept of big data really applies to this work, and so these are a handful of the people that are working on the projects. We also had the privilege of working with the producers of a film that was made for the public television called Ride the Tiger. And therein, there were two individuals who were interviewed and on a panel, and one lady said to me, I really would not want to lose, or, I have bipolar disorder. I don't necessarily want that to go away. It's part of whom I am, but please keep me from getting manic or depressed. And so there's a question from an audience member, and said, being bipolar, I'm grateful to have medicine that regulates/moderates my manic depressive moods, but I would never want to be, quote unquote, cured or lose my creativity. How do you treat the illness without changing the person? And so that's a laudable question, and I just realized on the panel we don't have actually any physicians on there to that, since we're focused on our research. But I will, challenge a discussion from you, and you're all looking for management strategies. So Sue, do you want to?
No. I think this is your call, Melvin.
Well, our way of managing the illness is to work with folks like you to devise better ways to treat the illness. We desperately need new treatments. We desperately need new strategies to treat individuals with bipolar disorder. And we desperately need new ways to monitor someone, which is what Emily is working on. And we desperately need to understand what is it in the environment and what we eat and what we do that either helps us in a way to stay well, and we also need people such as the work that Stephanie Procter is doing to get the word out and manage that, and what Mimi is doing. And I think that the emphasis is truly this is a concerted team effort in every way, and that. So I'll hand it back to you folks for a discussion, on that.
I have a quick comment. So I was diagnosed back in 2001, shortly after my dad passed away. My first major episode was at 18, but it took a while to properly diagnose. I would say I have bipolar, and that's something that I don't necessarily completely define myself with. And B, this is an ongoing, lifelong. We don't have a magic cure. I don't think that's coming anytime soon. So for the time being, management is our best go-to, and so being constantly, being as self-aware as you can be, really harnessing what your resources are, and taking note of that. And this all might sound trite, but sleeping and eating and all those basic regimen, having a routine, having really great friends, having a good community, good family. But in addition to all of that, I have to say that I actually had ECT at one point, and I feel like that was also beneficial for me. So there are a number of different treatments out there, and it really has to do with it's a case by case. So that's really all I can offer.
Thanks. Thank you. Simon, do you want to comment on the strategy for diet and nutrition?
Yeah, just to echo Stephanie's point about really paying attention to the fundamentals. I mean, I think very simply about the problem. And in medicine, I think oftentimes we strive for the high-tech solution and ignore the fundamentals of eating well and sleeping and taking care of yourself. And, that can help anybody, whether you have a diagnosed disorder or not. If you had a Lamborghini, you wouldn't put sludge in the gas tank and then take it to the mechanic and ask him to, make it perform. You would treat it well. And
Can you comment on the work that you've done?
Sure. So I first got into this work really looking at some observational studies in our bipolar subjects and controls, looking at diet, and found significant differences in how bipolar patients eat, specific nutrient intakes, and then associations with those. So basically, the biggest thing I found is that bipolar patients were eating less healthy fats than regular controls, higher carb and lower in healthy fat diet, and the healthy fat intake associated with reduced sleep quality, increased anxiety, increased mania, or not so much mania, but increased depression and anxiety. And that work really led to another arm of the work to look at the gut-brain axis and the microbiome, which is the composition of bacteria that live in your digestive system, that live in all of our digestive systems. And there's a lot of emerging data that that bacterial community and the actions, the metabolic actions of that bacterial community influence neurochemistry and influence behavior, certainly during development, but also throughout adulthood as well. And I think it's no stretch of the imagination to understand that the foods you eat affect the bacteria that live in your gut. And I think there's a significant link there. So we're currently trying to identify dietary patterns that will lower the burden of disease, help people control the disorder better. There's no diet that's going to cure bipolar. Nobody's claiming that. But we may be able to find dietary patterns to either avoid or to get more of to reduce the burden of disease, especially sleep quality, anxiety, and depression.
Thank you. Mimi, do you know in your family, are people being conscious of their diet and living habits?
No, it really hasn't gotten to that point. My niece has been officially diagnosed as bipolar, and she is now doing a lot of work for NAMI in New York. But she is the one she's doing yoga. She is watching her diet. She's very conscious of that. She's conscious of the awareness of her body. She's really listening to her body, and she's gotten to know that. But everybody else, all the people that I mentioned in my family, are not at that. They're not at that stage yet. But I think that Mitzi, my niece, will be the one to bring the younger generation along by setting an example of what she's doing. It just takes one person in a family, and I think it's, when the others get diagnosed or whatever their situation is, I think Mitzi will be a big help.
Mm. Yeah. So Simon's work, the impressive thing that I found with your work, Simon, is that it's very challenging to change dietary habits of individuals to, from just the impulsive kind of fast food eating to a healthier diet. It is difficult to do that. Emily, there are a number of questions regarding priority in the cell phone study, ranging from, are you using Watson, the IBM, to...
Not in this project, but in a different project, actually, we are.
Yeah. And are there specific examples of vocal change studies that indicate we can anticipate a descent into depression or an ascent into mania?
Yeah, so mania actually is a much less well-researched area in terms of the speech community. The bulk of research has looked at the content of speech rather than the acoustics or the sound of speech. And one of the principles that we hold very dear in this study, particularly when you're talking about collecting large amount of cell phone data, is privacy. And so one of the challenges that we constantly face is how we can process speech data without violating these principles of privacy. And so we're not looking at speech content, we're not looking at the words that are spoken, we're purely looking at the sounds. And so with respect to the processing of acoustic data, that information is primarily in the realm of depression research rather than in research with bipolar disorder. And one of the things that people have really found to be effective is trying to think about how we can operationalize knowledge that's known from the clinical side. A brief aside about this, I think one of the only way that a collaboration between very different disciplines works is if both sides sit down together and say, what is my fundamental question? What is my fundamental question? What do we have in common? What do we both think is interesting? And so one of the things that has happened in depression is that people have been trying to figure out how to operationalize this knowledge that when people experience episodes of depression, their speech becomes monotonic. There's not a lot of change. And for a long time in the speech community, research has been very frustrated by this because what that should mean is that if you look at someone's pitch, the patterns of what's called the fundamental frequency of their voice, in singing, I'm not going to do that, but what would make me higher or lower, I was in tune. People have looked for changes for when people are healthy versus when they're unwell. And there have been very few differences, which was something that people found very frustrating. One thing that people have found recently is that by looking at the higher order resonances, so how speech is reflected in the vocal tract and how that happens at higher and higher frequencies, if you look at patterns in that information, you actually can start to see that when people are depressed, there's less variation. And so what we're seeing is that you can take the knowledge that exists on the clinical side and figure out the engineering correlate, but it's not always the obvious answer. And so I think that's what's so exciting about research that exists from both sides. From our side, what we've seen, both for mania and for depression, we found that characterizing the rhythm of somebody's speech is highly effective in both cases. It's very challenging to say purely that the speed decreases or the speed increases, because we work with a huge number of variables to actually be able to do these types of predictions accurately. But I can say that the rhythm of speech itself is very predictive with respect to if someone is likely to be experiencing either manic or depressive symptoms.
So the story comes, I mentioned, we've talked about, that people have said, I could hear it in their voice. And so that, I've had parents tell me, I call my kid in college and I can hear they have to have 3 words and I can tell there's something wrong. And so I came to the engineers and I was explaining, this is what we're hearing. And the engineer just said, well, why don't you just tell the family to inform the individual that they're speaking differently and then tell them to go to hospital for care? And I thought, what a great idea. This is, we hadn't thought of that. But the problem, of course, is that we don't have, we have many a case, where family members, they're not the best people to give advice to, and it's very difficult for us to receive advice from our families, and in particular when they're in these situations. So, our goal is to try to find it in advance before the individual realizes that they're really going manic.
Yeah, and actually this idea of hearing it in his or her voice is something that we've been trying to figure out how to actually implement recently. And so there's this community of speech research that's called speaker verification, which means that if I provide you with 10 seconds of speech, can you tell me if this is the person, yes or no? And one of the things we've been doing recently is trying to say, well, can we use the same types of ideas to actually characterize whether or not someone sounds like him or herself when he or she is unwell? And so this is another example of how we can partner up to take clinical knowledge, take engineering techniques, and think about where the overlap actually is in terms of designing effective technologies.
So, Sue O'Shea, in terms of the novel treatments, in terms of finding new treatments, the challenge is that many of the treatments that we have currently are really traceable back to the 1950s in the sense of the medications that we have. How will the research in induced pluripotent stem cells help us to find new medications, and what are the implications for that?
Okay. So one of the things that we're doing in the laboratory is taking, for example, neurons that come from individuals with bipolar disorder versus undiagnosed controls, and we're looking at what genes they express. And then we take these huge databases and kind of fold them down and try to simplify them a little bit. So we just got back this massive RNA-seq analysis of gene differential expression patterns. And one of the pathways, the signaling pathways, is very different between the 2 cell types from 2 different groups of people, is something that's called the Hippo Pathway. And so I was really excited because I couldn't think that anybody had ever identified Hippo pathway signaling as being different. And Hippo is important because it controls cell size and cell growth and cell death. And so I was really excited, and so I went to the literature to see if there had ever been anything reported on bipolar disorder, and of course there was. But the really cool thing is that there's a small molecule that can inhibit this pathway, and if this is really dysregulated in some individuals, but not all individuals with bipolar, we could use this very small molecule as a medicine to sort of treat the symptoms. So that's the kind of thing that we hope to find from these large data scales, that we're using to identify differences between the two groups?
Right. And there are, of course, there are questions regarding how we at the University of Michigan can meet the treatment needs and outpatient services here in Ann Arbor and in Southeast Michigan. And one has to first acknowledge that we are just not very good at meeting all the treatment needs. It's very painful to appreciate or to know that we're unable to do that. The time lapse of getting an appointment is woefully long. The strategies that we are working towards and trying to implement involve working with the primary care docs and involving getting those individuals better educated, more comfortable with using medications such as lithium. In my bipolar clinic at the moment, we have a fellow who is training in family practice, and she came to me and said, I want to learn how to treat people with bipolar disorder. And so I said, great. And so she's now comfortable with using lithium, and just by spending a month in our clinic. We appreciate that we're not going to be able to quickly solve the problems. It is impossible to train the number of individuals that will be needed to provide the types of care that we would like to do or to provide. So it's the impact. What is the impact of what we are doing? We are an academic institution. We do a lot of research, and the focus of the bipolar research that we do is in the capacity to develop predictive methods to identify when somebody is in need of help. So if you imagine that, to think through, there are 10 million people in the state of Michigan. How many people with bipolar I disorder do we have in this state? 1%, 100,000. How many individuals of those 100,000 with bipolar I disorder should be getting care this very moment, this evening? And they are out there ill, out of control because of their mania, or at risk for self-harm because of their suicide. So it's our mission to identify the risk features using technology, and our mission to identify strategies to treat them with the stem cell work. And we would love to be able to provide the treatment that we would like to, but it's very, very difficult to do that when we have a hard time recruiting people to the field, and a hard time just providing all the resources that are there. There's a question here about lithium, and you referred to Cade and John Cade. And so I was going to ask you to share with us what you've learned about lithium and with John Cade, because you rightly so compare the brilliance of your father to the fortuitous discoveries of John Cade.
I'm afraid I'm not a researcher by heart. I absolutely paid no attention to what he did. I was just fascinated that my father had written his work, written his perception of the biochemical component 5 years ahead of time. I was captivated by that, and I really didn't have the time, because I was on a roll writing this, that I didn't stop and investigate things from a scholarly point of view. So I have to just explain that maybe that's for another day, but I just didn't have time to do that.
It's a very interesting story, and it really involves the fortuitous observation that the experimental animals that he was working with, guinea pigs, if you will, they were calmed by the use of lithium. And he was not using lithium in order to try to calm them, but he was using it for another experiment regarding a kidney disease. And he noticed that lithium calmed these animals, and he said, well, if it calms these animals, maybe it'll calm individuals with bipolar disorder. But if I would not give anybody any medications that I would not take myself, so he took lithium himself at ridiculously high doses. Nobody knew how to dose it at the time, and he found himself alive after a week, and so he said to himself, seems okay. And so then he went and he started treating his patients with bipolar disorder with lithium at much lower doses, because he wanted to stress his own body out by giving himself a really high dose. And he discovered that these patients were calmer. Then a delightful gentleman in Denmark discovered the writings of John Cade, and he had a twin brother with bipolar disorder, so he got some lithium and started treating his brother with lithium, and that's how the story Well, it's a very humbling story as to how things are discovered. So,
you answered the question a lot better than me, but thank you for giving me the opportunity.
I was thrilled. I was thrilled to know that you had thought about it and that. And so it's a wonderful story, and it parallels your father and the things that he did.
Can I say something? So I would say that the essential difference in those two stories is a fortuitous observation that someone applied. They saw that they were calmed by this particular chemical and they used it. And the difference between Mimi's father's work and that work is that your dad was really trying to get at an experiment, an understanding of the mechanism that underlied perhaps a response to something in the blood. And I think that's a very different kind of mindset that we have as scientists, to do those kinds of experiments instead of just observational research. I don't mean to lessen his contribution to the lithium, but I think it's a real different paradigm that we have as scientists.
So I have a question for you, Stephanie. How do you think that we can best in society not only raise better awareness for mental illness, but raise community support and acceptance for people being able to feel more comfortable being open about their illness?
That's a great question. It's like I wrote that question. And so, I'm sorry. So the question is, how are we going to raise the awareness and build better support?
Yeah, community.
So this has been a part of my world since '98, essentially. And I was really active in a lot of ways for a while, and then I had to step back from it. And the one thing that I kept coming back to is building resilience and focusing on empowerment. And so I kind of get away from the clinical and the treatment and the research because I want to apply it directly and I want to see a direct impact. And I mean, this is a really tough question to answer, but it is also, I believe, probably my life mission to try to figure out how to create community, to change the language, the way in which we talk to one another. That affects our mental health. The way in which we, define mental health and physical health. Like, I talked about this 10 years ago, and we're still talking about it. So I think, again, yes, communicating and being open and honest with what it is that we're feeling and what it is that we're sharing. Also to add weight and to value to our experiences. And gosh, to create communities of support. I want to stop talking about the word stigma. I think that word, it reflects ignorance and darkness and something that sort of represses you. Instead, let's move forward. Let's get beyond that. I know we're not there yet, but I'd like to see a world in which maybe when you go to the psychiatric ward, it's not completely separate from everything else. Or, they have hospitals still set up the way in which Dr. Baird was hospitalized in some ways. It just feels very isolated. The clubhouse that I'm part of, it's the clubhouse model, if people are aware of that. I believe that right there is sort of a nugget of what we can look for in the future of where wellness will come from. It's really communities using every resource available to really make this something that, I don't know, we can tackle a little bit easier. I don't think that was all that articulate, but I'm still working on this. And I think all of us, again, just have to be really very sensitive to other people's experience. You would never look at me and think that I was actually at the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco and hogtied. Police officers hogtied me. And when Mimi spoke about her dad in front of the Ritz, I looked at my mom, and we instantly thought of that experience. And so right there, talking with police and getting them involved with community resources and support. I could go on, and I should probably write a paper about this, but I'm extremely passionate about this not just being in the research lab. We have to be out in the community and talking with every single stakeholder. And I know it's convoluted, but there's a lot to do.
Simon, please.
I just wanted to add to what you're saying, because this is exactly the kind of thing that my niece Mitzi is doing. She's through telling her own story, she's going to police stations, she's talking to EMTs, she's the first responders, all of that kind of thing. And that's a huge contribution. It's a hard nut to crack, but it's a beginning.
It is, yeah. Yeah, and joining forces with the arts and sciences, and we have, Dr. McGinnis has done an awesome job collaborating with these different schools and different fields of thought. That's the beginning of this innovation and how we're going to try to crack, all of the safe. I don't know. And again, it's so ongoing every day. So.
Sue.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think that we as scientists also bear some brunt and some responsibility for not getting out there and not speaking properly to the public, taking the time to go out and do these kinds of talks, that hopefully we're speaking to you and getting the message across that there really is a biological basis. And if you want to look at some of the cells that we differentiate from the cultures, we've got some pictures out in the lobby. You can kind of visualize the differences that occur between neurons and glial cells. And I think we just need more opportunities, and we need to take the time to do these kinds of things.
I agree. I want to just, Simon, ask you to take the mic for a moment and comment on this, because I think that reaching into the community with, just healthy living habits is a positive thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the, going on Sue's point, one of the responsibilities we have to engage the public is, I think the public believes that we know more than we do, I mean, I think there's this perception in the public that scientists kind of have all this knowledge and doctors have it all figured out and they know exactly what to do, and it's just not true. We just, we know much less than the public thinks, and I think we need to be proactive in being honest about that and engaging the public. And when it comes to your specific question about promoting healthy diets, really the only advice we have is the advice that your grandmother gave you. At this point, we're doing research, we're trying to figure out specific patterns, we're trying to figure out the details, but we don't know the details yet, and until we know them, we never feel comfortable talking about them. And I think that's one of our problems as scientists is we're so skeptical of our own data that we don't feel like it's ready to share with anybody, and we need to somehow bridge that.
Yeah, I agree, and I want to just endorse your point, Stephanie, about the concept of stigma. I don't particularly like that word, and I think the word itself is stigmatizing in its own right, just to use the word on itself, in its own way. And so I think that I feel strongly that it is with the work that you guys are doing, that we're doing collectively together here with so many people and the individuals that are participant collaborators in our studies. I mean, we're all collaborating in a very powerful way to learn more about the illness. And I've had people tell me, Dr. McGinnis, I just feel better participating in this research because I'm contributing and I'm aware. And that there's a question here about going back to Priori and the cell phone study, Emily. Do you think that we will be able to give bipolar patients more than the common warning signs of an episode? And another one, have you worked out the algorithms yet? An algorithm is spelled correctly, so it's somebody who knows what they're talking about.
So one of the reasons why we're so excited to be working in this domain with these types of longitudinal data is that one thing that we know, not even from only bipolar disorder, but from so many types of illnesses, is that everyone presents in a different way. Everyone has symptoms that are unique to that individual, and the way they show up indicates the presence of illness in a different way for each person. And so one of the things we're really excited about working with a single group of people over a long period of time is really trying to learn early warning signs that are associated with particular individuals. Because we really do believe that if we want to have effective strategies for warning individuals, then we need to think about people as individuals. And so, as Melvin mentioned, one of the great things about having access to these types of big data, and we've collected almost 47,000 phone calls. We have approaching 3,700 hours of speech that we've collected at this point, is that we're really beginning to be in a position to ask this question about how we can design algorithms, how we can design features, which are these short time measurements of speech, that will allow us to really build early warning signs on an individual rather than on a giant population level. So it's something that we're very excited about. In terms of algorithm design, that is the heart of our research question. It's not only how can we figure out which types of short time measurements, which types of ways of quantifying the speech signal we should be considering, but also how do we integrate that information? How do we take all of that information and predict something? There's been a lot of research recently, if anyone's familiar with the advances in speech recognition, and something that's called deep learning. And the idea here is that if you have huge amounts of data and highly nonlinear models, you can develop very, very strong prediction tools. So one of the things that we've been investigating, both in this project, in our projects looking at speech feedback for people with aphasia, and our projects with emotion, is really thinking about how we can use these types of technology not only for estimating the content of speech in terms of word choice, but also in terms of mood, or in terms of speech quality, or in terms of emotion. So that's one avenue of research that we're pursuing. We're also looking at how you can essentially control for factors that might not be relevant to the problem at hand. So for example, speech doesn't only contain moods. Speech contains the content of speech, the words that you're using, the words that you're speaking. It contains information about your gender. It contains information about your emotion. And so the other thing that we're very, very interested in thinking about is how you can design algorithms that will allow you to control for these factors, so that instead of treating speech as one uniform whole that is only, of course, only modulated by mood, we can really start to think about all the ways speech changes to really have better insight into how we might be able to predict how mood changes what we're hearing.
Thank you. As we're winding down to the end here, and I'm reminded by one question that is really kind of fundamental to the evening, and that is, what do you think could, and it's got a little thing in here, so could be, instead of is, the most visible difference between mania and depression? So it's a fundamental question. So I'm going to address it from a clinical point of view, and I'm going to ask each one of you to comment on it from your own perspectives. And so I've come to, so mania is the manic phase where the individual is energized and active. The speech is going faster, the thoughts are going faster, and everything is just charged up. Depression, on the other hand, is where everything is slowed down. Thoughts are going slower, just everything is slowed down, the motivation is down, difficulties with all bodily functions, low appetite, poor sleep, and so on. I think of it as a disorder of energy, in that there's an energy in the brain. Mimi described her father's energy, and when he was in these states, he was just going, and then in the depressive states, things are slowed down. So that is my simple, short version of the difference between mania and depression. So mania, high energy, depression, low energy. And so we just got about 2 or 3 minutes left, so I'm going to ask each one of you to give a really concise summary from your experiences and your research, what the differences are.
I mean, I can't really, I'm not a clinician, and I don't see patients, but one thing I've learned from your group is that mania and depression are not extreme ends of a continuum, that they can co-occur, and that you can have aspects of mania and depression simultaneously in this very mixed state model, and I think that's a very interesting way to look at it, and I think it's probably not well understood. I think most people who don't understand the disease think of mania and depression as 2 different extremes, and it's not.
That's correct. The mixed states where you have a lot of energy, but yet a dysphoric mood. Yeah, I agree.
So one of the things that as a speech researcher you get very excited about is when you hear that something has to do with energy. One of the things that speech is really, really good at doing is determining different levels of energy. And so for us, although we focus so far on characterizing speech in terms of rhythm, one of the things that we are very interested in exploring further is really how we can get at that essential truth. How can we figure out how to introduce new ways of quantifying or modeling speech that really get at this aspect of different levels of energy? And how can we understand how variations in the patterns of how energy is expressed tell us something about impending mood changes?
So this is a question that we've thought a lot about in the laboratory because, you know, you can simplify it to the point that you've got a slow neuron that doesn't interact very often with the neurons around it. You can say that there might be a hyperactive neuron that's calmed by lithium. But I think, in fact, it's much more complicated than that. And well, reducing cell behavior and therefore human behavior to something we can actually study in a culture dish makes it really possible for us to do experiments and look at drugs and behavior of the neurons. I think it's going to turn out to be much more difficult, and we've got to think about this much more before we reduce it simply to activity in a dish. So it's a real concern for us, and it's something that we have to think about constantly about what we're really modeling.
And I'm reminded by the famous mathematician, I believe it was George Box, who pointed out that all models are wrong, some are useful. So what we're working with is, is models here, and so we want to think through how the models are useful. Stephanie.
Oh, Mimi, do you want to? Okay, so I have thought about this a little, and I think that for me it is self-perception. So the way in which that varies with mania and with depression. With depression, my self-perception is that I am not capable of loving. No one loves me. I can't feel that love. The list goes on. Obviously, energy is low, and the world feels like a really scary place, and it feels like a really tough thing to even get up in the morning. With mania, again, self-perception. I feel pretty confident. I feel almost invincible, and things flow pretty easy and pretty quick, and everything's kind of falling into place. And so self-perception, and then I guess the way in which you relate to the world, and clearly that has to do with perception, and the way in which the world relates to you, that varies on a spectrum between the mania and the depression. And just to speak to someone who was talking about afraid of losing who they are, or who they were by being overtreated, in my point of view and with my experience, you won't lose who you are if you get to know really what your core is. And so that's what I encourage people to do. That's my feedback.
For the final comment, Mimi.
Well, my experience would come from observing my niece when she was living in Woodstock for 1 year. So this is really my only experience. And when she was on the high level, oh my heavens, she was racing here and there. She had all sorts of great ideas of what she was going to do in the future. She was applying for one job after another. And there was just no way of slowing that frenetic activity down. And whenever we were going to get together, she had so much going on that she almost forgot we were going to get together. So that I was her aunt, so I understood that. I've never spoken to her about observing this, so if she's listening tonight, this is the first time she's going to know that. So there were all these, such wonderful ideas and such purposeful things that she wanted to do. It was all helping others that were afflicted like herself. So it was all good. But then on the downside, I observed her, not being able to get out of bed for one day at a time, not being able to eat, and a lot of crying and things like that. And it just breaks your heart, because there's nothing that you can do about that. You have to let it run its course. And she was getting some help at Dartmouth and things of that nature. But she had a thyroid problem, so I'm sure that other types of maybe illnesses that somebody has will interfere with the mania or the depression as well. And but the wonderful thing is that she's come out of that period, and I think has so much more. You kind of have to experience this and be aware of it, but I think she has so much more a grasp of her ebb and flow, and more able to know what to do when it's starting to happen. But that's my only experience.
So with that, I just wanted to say that I know that Heinz and Perry would be or are very proud of their daughters. And so we're just so honored and thrilled to have you two here tonight. And our journey this evening has now come to a close, and I want to thank Mimi particularly for sharing her journey with us about her father's journey throughout his experiences and his mental illness. And again, to reiterate the phenomenal contribution that you are making to mankind and to humanity with your work. It's much appreciated in every way. I want to thank the researchers and the panelists for joining us this evening and sharing with us their insights on the research and where the direction of the research is going. I think we're onto something. I think we're going to get there. I think that that good things are happening. I tell everybody that the world is literally bounding with opportunities to do good things in the world, and I'm so proud to be a part of that with you all. I want to thank you all for coming this evening. I want to thank particularly Wally Proctor for her support over the years and for having the 10th annual Heinz C. Procter Bipolar Lecture, and we're so proud of all the contributions that everyone has made here tonight and for coming and sharing their time and being a part of this journey this evening. So thank you all. I also want to share with you that out in the area we have, or the Antrim area, we have some vendors there. We have Crazy Wisdom with the book, with Mimi's book that's for sale, and she will sign that graciously. We have also the Pangborn design that has ties and scarves available there, and just model my I have one, and although they all 100% of the proceeds actually goes to the Procter Research Fund as well. And of course, we have our wonderful friend, colleague, and just a person, Liz Guz, who has been making jewelry and sharing the proceeds of her jewelry with the Procter Fund for 6 years or more, and is out there that. And we also have some refreshments and something to eat, and we'll be out there chatting and having a grand time. So thank you all for coming, and please enjoy.